It's a pretty old aeroplane. It was built in 1937 and it flew up until 1974.
Wow.
Hasn't flown since then. It's got quite a history. It was originally built for KLM and it was operating around Europe. But in 1939, when the Second World War started, they had to get the aeroplanes out of Europe, so they sent them over to their bases in the Dutch East Indies. In 1941, late 1941, early 42, when the Japanese entered the Second World War, they had to get them out of there, so they sent them all to Australia.
Okay.
And that's how this ended up in Australia. Well, this was the last aeroplane of their fleet that left Batavia, and it couldn't take off from the airport because it would be taking off over an enemy position. So they took off from the roadway leading to the airport. They had on board the governor and his staff and a few airline personnel, and they flew across to Port Hedland and then on to Sydney. When they arrived in Sydney, they were supposed to hand the aircraft over to the Australian government at £5 per aircraft, and just to make it a legal sale.
Yeah.
General MacArthur, who was in Melbourne at that time, said, "That's not on, I want these aeroplanes for the US Army Air Force." And to make sure that he got them, he stopped them from getting any fuel or parts or anything like that. So finally they had to hand them over. But in protest, during a proving flight, this aeroplane plus another DC-3 and a DC-5 on a proving flight in formation were flown under the Sydney Harbour Bridge, turned around and flew back the other way. So it's one of the few aeroplanes that's flown under the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Yeah.
Do it today and you probably would lose your licence completely. Anyway, General MacArthur said, "This is the aeroplane I want for my own private aeroplane." So about halfway down the right-hand side, they took the seats out and put a table there with a big fancy chair. And down on this side, they had a couple of levels of bunks, so on long flights they could have a rest. He went from Melbourne to Canberra and back to Melbourne, and on the way back to Melbourne on descent, he got a nosebleed. And obviously the pilot descended a bit fast, they're not pressurised, and he had a cold possibly. And he never flew in the aeroplane again. He said, "That's it, don't want to fly in this one anymore." So it just went into the transport wing for the remainder of World War II. After that it moved into the hands of Australian National Airlines, and then went to Butler Air Transport. ANZA took over Butler Air Transport, so it then became part of Airlines in New South Wales. And that's the colours it's painted in now.
Yeah.
And it flew with them up until 1972. And that's the year that ANZA stopped flying any DC-3s. They were all either sold or scrapped. This aeroplane was kept for a while, and it didn't fly with the airline, but it did a few charter flights and that up until 1974. And it has not flown since then. The DC-3 was an interesting aircraft. It came out in 1935, the first one in December 1935, and it was an enlarged version of the original DC-2s. DC stands for Douglas Commercial, and so it was the number 2. Douglas didn't even want to get into commercial aviation. They were so busy building service aircraft for America. But they were offered a good enough deal that they designed the DC-1, which is a one-off prototype, and from it came the DC-2. Now the difference with the DC-2 was, instead of being rounded like this, it had flat sides, so you could have one seat either side of the aisle, that's all, much narrower. But apart from that, it was pretty well the same size. Well, this came about in 1935 because American Airlines said it takes about 17 hours of flying to fly across the States. It was dropping down, putting on fuel and going again and so forth. It'd be so much easier if people could sleep on these things rather than had long trips like that. And so that's why Douglas got the contract to widen the DC-2 and came up with this design. And initially it had 14 bunks, much like the Pullman railway carriages in the States of the 1930s. And also up in this area here, above the window, there was some slit windows. It wasn't long before Americans said, oh, well, if we're not going to use it for the long flights, for the shorter flights, we'll just put passengers in it. So it came out with 21 seats in it. And it had 7 windows. Since then, they haven't stretched it, but they've made more of this area available. So it has 8 windows. Then they managed to put 28 seats in it. And from early 1942 onwards, they all came out as transports or freighters or whatever. And there were C-47s, C-52s, C-117s, depending which service was using them and what they were using them for. They built just under 600 of these as DC-3s before 1942. After that, America built 10,000 of the military versions. Russia built 5,000 and Japan built 500. So everyone was using it. But Japan had a license to build them before they entered Second World War. That's why they had them. So in all, there's about 16,000 of them built. At the moment, there's about 165 of them still flying around the world. All good airframes are bought up by an American crowd that actually stretched the nose section a little bit and put turbine engines in them. So they'll be going for another 80 years. There's no airframe flying now that hasn't been flying for at least 70 years. So it says a lot for the airframe. They were overbuilt to blazes because in those days they didn't have the stress analysis that we have now, all that sort of things, and they were still feeling their way, so they just made them stronger to cope with the thing. They're very strong. You can land them anywhere if you had to. You could land it in a paddock. They've got big balloon tyres and that. As a matter of fact, if you can't get the wheels down, you can still land it because the bottom half of the wheel sticks out of itself.
Oh, okay.
The only thing you have to get your propellers out of the way. You'll bend the props if the motors are still going, but apparently someone in the States did it once with 2 engines shut down. He glided in and with the starter motors positioned the propellers so they were like this in one stroke, and that meant the propellers cleared the ground and didn't put a mark on the aeroplane because it was still sitting on the wheels and the tail.
Oh, wow.
You flew them in all sorts of weathers. I was flying them out of Melbourne, down around Bass Strait, King Island, Flinders Island, Tassie. And the weather's atrocious down there, particularly in winter. So you'd be flying around in the middle of the night doing a freighter at 500 feet at King Island with gale force winds, pelting rain, couldn't see a thing, you still managed to get in. That was so good. You had to work, you had to really work, but you could do it. You couldn't do it now. There's no way in the world we'd even be allowed to do the sort of things we were doing then.
I appreciate the simple things, 'cause I'm awful fond of getting love in a natural setting. This is what I call the simple things. Just a winding stream where I can drift and dream, and now I'm waiting for you. By a waterfall, I'm calling you. We can share it all beneath a ceiling of blue. We'll spend a heavenly day here where the whispering waters play. There's a whippoorwill that's calling you. By a waterfall, he's dreaming too. There's a magic melody Mother Nature sings to me beside a waterfall with you.